So thank you all for coming to our talk. This, as we said, is Raiders of the New Tech Stack, the XM Cloud Adventure with Children's National Hospital. My name's Chris. I've been working with SUGCON for 15 years. And as I just mentioned, I do actually have a bullwhip to complete this costume, and it is contraband. You can't bring it on an airplane.
Hi, and I'm Matt. I do not have a bullwhip. I have more than 7 years of experience just building solutions in SUGCON for a number of different clients. Been an MVP before, and I'm the enablement optimization lead at Valier. And I can play 4 different instruments. So that's a random fact about me.
So for today's agenda, we're kind of structuring this like an adventure, making it a little fun. We're going to start with like defining our quest. We're going to talk about the map. We're going to talk about preparing for your expedition into the XM Cloud Adventure, how you're going to find the path, and then, challenges, trials and tribulations, brave and the unknown, and then finally, fortune and glory when you actually launch the site and hopefully get paid. So let's start with the quest.
So the quest we set out on was to re-envision, redesign, redevelop this enterprise web presence for Children's National Hospital. Primary goals of the project included making sure that we had a cohesive user experience, consistent visual design throughout it, and that we had this built on a modern, flexible, shared technology platform. We wanted to make sure as well that we were leveraging the latest and greatest capabilities of SUGCON for this project. And of course, we had to do all this across 5 different sites in the instance with 5 different stakeholder groups and all kinds of other fun stuff going into that. And when we came out of it, we needed to have a reusable component library across all of them. And when we were sitting down and defining the success criteria for this quest, the Children's National Hospital wanted a modern look and feel on a flexible design system. They needed a modern looking, responsive, and accessible front end. So accessibility was a big requirement throughout this entire process for all the sites. We needed to ultimately improve the customer experience, increase conversions, and improve operations. So a lot of different things in play here.
All right, so now that we've sort of defined what was asked of us, let's talk about, the map we put together to get there. So we're going to start with the hard requirements, right? So the final delivery of designs had 90 distinct page designs, and that's a lot, right? It is across 5 different sites. Some sites had more page designs than others, like the main site had a lot more than, say, the foundation site, which was very targeted on driving donations.
That was just counting the desktop designs, though.
Right, yeah. So that broke down to over 300 feature tickets. A feature is not necessarily a component you drop on the page, like it could be an aspect of an integration, but 300 discrete features that we had to implement. And a lot of those features needed to be shared across the 5 different sites. Meaning if I've got a promo I can drop on the main site, they want to be able to use that same promo on the international site, on the foundation site, and so on. So, in an effort to try to keep the feature count, get the most bang for their buck with these features. We also had multilingual, and if you went to the talk just before this in the main auditorium, we're going to be getting to multilingual later, but that was a requirement, including, right to left languages, Arabic. We had to handle Arabic and Spanish. And accessibility requirements. Their current site, while it is accessible, it is not, they have some, violations to those accessibility rules. So making sure that they're fully compliant with all the accessibility rules was a very big focus of this. So on top of the site core build, we also had a pile of integrations, more than what we're listing here, but these were some of the big ones. Kairos, this is a hospital, so this was the integration with their provider system. AACT, which is their clinical trial system, if you need to look up their research, clinical trials, and find information about that. Caveo, which is our search provider. Luminate, which is what they were using to drive donations to their foundation. They had a separate WordPress blog, and we needed to be able to integrate with that and like sort of seamlessly merge those blog posts into the various sites. And finally, form stacks for any and all forms they needed to do. So overall, pretty ambitious quest we're setting ourselves out on here. So the first thing we asked ourselves, we started on this project back in early 2022, and it is now late 2023. So we've been doing this for a while. And we haven't spent the whole time in development. There was a whole design phase. But, one of the first things we asked ourselves is, like, do we do XM Cloud, right? Like, if you go back to March, April, May 2022, like, it was a thing, but it was kind of in beta, right? If you had just come from SUGCON in, what was it, Budapest? Budapest, yeah, like there was a demo and it crashed on the main stage. So like, do we use this thing? Is it ready? So we had to ask ourselves a couple questions. So the first one was like, we know we can do this project with Sitecore XP, right? We're very confident we can. We've delivered big implementations like this before. But, if we go with XP, and we can like leverage the skills of our team, right? And that's a big deal. Like we've got a whole staff of developers who are fully, trained up on .NET and all that. However, one of the sort of visions for this is they wanted to use the latest and greatest. They wanted to set themselves up to be future-proof, right? So if we want to be future-proof, the tide is there now, but the tide was going towards headless, right? So we decided, we're going to make the plunge. So we had to ask ourselves a few questions. First of all, what are the risks, right? We have to figure out what are the risks we're going to be facing when we try to embark on this. What are the added costs because of those risks? And then, how do we find out the answers to those questions? Because honestly, we had no idea. So, it is sort of a venture into the unknown, and there are always, risks in the unknown. That's the very nature of it. So we did our best to define those risks, answer the questions, and plan up front. So we've got here, you may have seen a chart like this before in other sort of Sitecore presentations. But if you're new to this sort of thing, here's our sort of preliminary technology map. So if you used MVC, now you're on Next.js. We went with Next.js. You can use .NET Core too. We went with Next.js. If you're not using SXA, well, you are now. That's just the way it is. You're using the content search API to pull content out. Now you're using GraphQL queries. If you're using personalization with XP, now you're using Sitecore personalized CDP. If you're using EXM, you're using Sitecore Send, right? So we're sort of mapping the old stuff to the new composable offerings. If you're using Solar Search for your front-end search provider, now you need something else. You could use Sitecore Search, which wasn't even a thing when we started this project, so we went with Coveo. If you're using Sitecore Forms, you need to use something else because there's no real equivalent for that even still right now. I heard it's coming soon. And if you're used to authoring an Experience Editor, now we've got Sitecore Pages, but turns out Experience Editor still works. So great, we've got a plan, we've got a map, we're ready to go. Like let's start building. Oops. So Next.js kind of punched us in the face, right? The best laid plans, they go sideways. And we had a very experienced Sitecore team, and they were really sort of like, what even is this? What are we doing? The documentation was not there yet. It's a lot better now. And there were a lot of challenges we had to overcome. So we are here today to share some of those things with you. So hopefully you don't get run over by this headless boulder. This is also me. So instead of diving right in like we did and getting flattened, let's start with a little bit of preparation. So let's start by defining what headless is. And I think this is an important thing to talk about because so many people we've talked to in the course of doing not only this project but other projects are they think they know what headless is, or they're just throwing it out because that's what everybody's saying. No, they don't really actually understand what's going on. So what is headless? I think in the simplest terms, it just means your content, you treat your content as a service, right? Your content is disconnected from the app that is handling the requests, your web requests. So headless does not mean serverless. right? That's another misconception I think a lot of people have is, we're in Next.js, right? That's front-end technology, it's JavaScript. So that means everything's happening in the browser, everything's happening client-side. No, that's not true. You still have a server, right? You have a Node.js server, or you have Vercel or something like that, and it is running an application. It just happens to be a JavaScript application. So Jamstack, everybody loves Jamstack, right? What is it? Oh, who knows? Not all headless sites are Jamstack, right? So to be Jamstack, and I'm sure a lot of people have Googled this, but to be Jamstack, it's sort of like, it stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup, I think, the Jam. So static site generation, I think, is really the differentiator that makes you a Jamstack implementation. So with those things in mind, now that you're starting to think headlessly, we're going to come back to that, you're thinking headlessly, you want to go deep on your requirements up front, right? So you want to identify any middleware and microservices you might need to the best of your ability. You want to assess your integrations, like, is this going to work with Next.js? I think a lot of the things we listed out, they either have APIs you can consume, or they have straight up implementations with Next.js and other front-end frameworks, so that's great. Build proofs of concept. Can't stress that enough. Don't just assume something's going to work, right, based on your prior experience with MVC. Make sure it works before you commit to doing it. And as I just said, don't make assumptions based on your previous MVC experience. And you're going to find that if you've been building with Sitecore MVC for years, you're going to have muscle memory. You're going to be doing this automatically and not even know you're doing it. And it may come back to bite you later. So try to be cognizant of that. So what skills does a team need to learn, right? Headless architecture, we just talked a little bit about that. You want to understand this so that you can try to steer the planning and requirements early on before your designers or some project manager or something commits to something that is just going to be really, really hard to do. Beyond that, there are the new technologies in play. So we're talking about React, we're talking about TypeScript, and then we're talking about Next.js. It's sort of like that's the flow of the technology to get to the Next.js sort of promised land. So we have found that diving right into Next.js, as I mentioned, it felt like a giant boulder. We had to build a foundation with our team to understand these technologies, how they worked. So in particular, the website Front End Masters, you may have heard of it. Great training modules on both React and TypeScript. I would say start there, then move into sort of the Sitecore examples and the Vercel examples on Next.js. And finally, new development patterns, right? The lines between backend and front end aren't clear anymore. All your business logic is being written in JavaScript or TypeScript, right? Normally, that was the .NET developer, that was the Sitecore developer, and the front end developer was responsible for markup. Now these lines are blurred. So we asked ourselves, like, do we teach our front-end developers Sitecore so they can bring all their front-end knowledge to bear and they just got to learn how to do templates and layouts and stuff like that? Do we teach our Sitecore developers, markup and CSS? Ultimately, we decided, like, our people are really good specialists at what they do, and we should continue to exploit that. So we still had a front-end team. We still had a back-end team. It just, the back-end team is now doing a lot of development in Next.js. And finally, we're going to talk about, your base camps. How are you going to work?
Yeah, so the first thing we want to talk about here is design and specs. Early on in the process, we want to get in front of this. Now, the process that we go through in this early phase of the project didn't change too much, but the important thing is those caveats. There are differences between what we used to do and what we need to do now. Now, if this is your first adventure, you probably don't have anybody on the team who's well-versed in what those differences are and what they look like. So this is going to be a little tough. We'll talk about some of them, and I'm sure we'll have more content coming out in the future that lays them out in excruciating detail. But for now, somebody needs to be aware that there are fundamentally different, big differences between the way things are done in these two worlds. There are new limitations, but there's also new features, and there's new flexibilities and things we can accomplish there. So some sort of ideally developer or technical liaison representative of that team in the early part of this process is going to be pivotal. And the more knowledge they have about the differences between these systems, the better off you're going to be.
So just take, not done with that one yet. Let's try to scroll the notes here. So just for some specifics on how the developers are going to work. If you went to Andy Cohen's talk just before this one, he gave some do's and don'ts. And that, some of that seems pretty obvious, but we had to learn some of those the hard way. So your Sitecore developers, we're talking your backend team, if you're still thinking of them that way, they're going to use local Docker containers that run XM Cloud, right? And we're going to be using Sitecore Serialize instead of TDS. Hopefully you've all given this a try by now. It's what we wanted all these years and never had, and had to use TDS and Unicorn. Serialize just built upon those foundations and made a tool that's like really awesome, and we're really happy with it. Our front-end teams, and the point of Serialize is to move your content, your templates, your layouts between your local environment and get it up into your tenant in XM Cloud, right? Get it into your different environments. That's what Serialize is for, and it's going to be part of your build process. Our front-end team, they work in a tool called Storybook. So what is Storybook, real quick, if you haven't heard of it? It's a sort of framework that allows you to design websites at the atomic level. So you build, atomic components, you roll those up into larger components. Those components get rolled up into even larger components to eventually to a full page design. And that's completely disconnected from anything you're doing with, whatever CMS or whatever it's sort of like, actual implementation you're doing. It's really sort of just to actualize the design into, real front-end markup in CSS. So then we've got our test environments, right? So our local devs, local workstation, Docker container running XM, an XM Cloud-like facsimile, front-end developers working Storybook. Our test environments, these are going to be your XM Cloud environments with Experience Edge and Vercel. That is super important, and we're going to get into why that's super important really soon. Okay, so we've planned, we've prepared. It's time to start now, right? We're gonna start on this journey. We're taking a break from the Indiana Jones memes for a moment because this one is fairly appropriate. Use the starter kit, everybody. We didn't have it. We had to figure it all out ourselves. I wish we had this thing. The starter kit is great. We used it. We're starting up another XM Cloud project. We started it up in August. We used the starter kit, and it saved us a tremendous amount of time. The starter kit was really, Sitecore listened to feedback from the partners, including Valir, and they put together what they feel like is sort of the best opinion on how to develop for XM Cloud right now. And it may change, right? As feedback and as these conferences roll on and they hear, the starter kit might change, but it's an accelerator, and you should absolutely take advantage of it. I already mentioned, Docker containers for your local environments. A properly configured SXA tenant, you get that from the starter kit, and this is it's required for Experience Edge. If you aren't using the SXA scaffolding, Experience Edge freaks out. We learned that the hard way too. You're going to get example components. You're going to get a Next.js project ready to deploy. Again, in the last talk, Andy demoed that in real time. It works. It's great. And if any of you remember Habitat, right? You can't just ship this thing. You want to tailor it to your project. So use it as a starting point. It's going to get you bootstrapped. Then tailor it on your local environments to be a starter for your project. It's a lot harder to unwind these things once you've deployed them to your cloud tenant than it is to do it on your local environment and make sure you've gotten it straight there.
Yeah. Wrong direction. One more. There we go. All right, so let's talk about how the team winds up working together throughout this process. And the highlights here in the groups that we're talking about are repeating what we were talking about when we were prepping for the team. But here, when we're talking about the UX and design teams, again, we want development representation in these meetings early on. It's not going to be absolutely pivotal when you're in a wireframe phase, but by the time you're looking at page designs, there should be definitely development representation in those meetings. Preferably front end, somebody thinks like an architect when they're looking at these pages. And if that's not a normal project process for you, you should fight as hard as humanly possible to make sure that it becomes one, especially for the first few of these. The other thing that we're going to want to do, especially your first time through here, is try to steer the direction of these things toward keeping the designs relatively simple. We want to strive for reuse, but not to the point where we try to make a single component something like a Swiss Army knife, because we're going to run into complications if we make any individual element try to do too much, especially as we're learning how to operate in these new environments. The more we can do in these early phases to just try and keep that kind of like design scope low is going to help as we're trying to figure out what's going on here. Having the development representatives in these early meetings is great. They should be getting exposure to the new stack that we're using as well at this point, so that we start doing the mental exercises of working through the solution in our head, right? Thinking about how would I do that as we're watching those designs come together. And that's what we're after, starting that thinking through the problem and solutioning it in the new tools as soon as humanly possible.
Thinking
Headlessly. Then when we dive into the spec and approval process there, where we wind up reviewing these with the clients for final approval on exactly what's getting built, which sometimes varies a bit from the designs, but ideally doesn't vary much. We need development representation here in the review process as well. Now there should be, because this is usually the point where work's being estimated, but I would highly recommend that you make more time than usual for this process. Again, we want to give the team time to start thinking through the solution in the new tools and making sure that there's a conceptually, at least a way that that can work in their minds, right? If there's anything that we're concerned about, well, I don't know exactly how I would do that. Work on getting POCs for those things out first. We want to make sure we're not agreeing to do anything that we haven't been able to know for certain is going to be possible. And those are really the big changes for how we were trying to work together in those early phases.
So talking a little bit about the developer collaboration, I mentioned Storybook earlier. We were able to, this is not something you'll see in the starter kit because they're not going to concern themselves with Storybook and that, but this is something that we were able to put together on our end. You know, they said, you know, don't make your front-end devs run a Sitecore container, right? Because they're all using Macs. I heard a Sitecore developer last night talk about how he wanted a Mac, and I was like, dude, don't. But the front-end team's all on Macs, right? They can't run Sitecore. Yeah, they can connect, you know, their local rendering host to the XM Cloud tenant, and indeed they will when they get to the point where they're implementing business logic. But Storybook is going to be the primary thing where we're doing design QA, right? And they can crank through those things faster, and it's sort of like a living. It's like a living repository of your markup and your CSS, right? So the great thing about Storybook is that it uses React. You know what else uses React? Next.js. So we were like, why can't we just make these things work together? So we put together a sort of a development pattern where we've got one master TSX file instead of a JSX, a TSX in TypeScript. And that is the primary entry point for the component in both Storybook and Sitecore. And we have a little bit of, you know, the pattern comes in where we're sort of mapping the mock properties versus the Sitecore layout service or whatever's coming out of GraphQL in sort of some mapping files. And I'm sure we could do a whole talk on that if, you know, we had a more technically focused one. But that has been pretty good for us. And we found that in the course of this process, like the lines of responsibility started to get blurred. Right, we talked about we've got front-end devs who are specialists in accessibility, specialists in CSS, specialists in markup. We got back-end devs who are specialists in data integration, specialists in Sitecore, They started like, you know what, I feel like I can do this bug about the margin. I can probably add this field to Sitecore even on my Mac, right? So those lines started to get blurred, and sort of the full stack developer just sort of started to evolve naturally like a Pokemon, the most natural creature on earth.
We're going to talk a little bit as well about Caveo, our enthusiastic sidekick here, as we were embarking on this. And I'm going to move through this piece a little bit faster, just for the sake of time, mostly. But we were looking for a search provider. As we were talking about earlier, Sitecore Search wasn't out yet, and we needed search because Solar wasn't an option. So we landed on Caveo. We landed on Caveo for a few different reasons, one of which is that it is Next.js compatible. It's got a proven track record. We've used it on a number of other projects. We're pretty good with it at this point, and there's almost a half dozen different implementation options for it. So it kept, it gave us options as we weren't sure exactly what we were getting into with a whole lot of other stuff, which wasn't going to be bad. We wound up with the implementation. There's Caveo crawlers for all the sites in the instance. We wound up going with Atomic, which we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of that later. And we've got search going on in more than a dozen different, like full site search going on a number, more than a dozen different pages showing different content types, pulling in content across sites, pulling in content from federated sites, like the WordPress blogs we were talking about earlier. And then we're also using it in some other places. Pulling in dynamic content in some cases where business logic was too complicated to handle with GraphQL. I think we get into that more later as well.
So let's talk a little bit about the happy path. I want to emphasize again, if you're new to this, start simple, right? Get a component, pick something simple, no interactivity, no integrations with any of your other sort of systems you're working with. Get something working. Follow the recipes that Sitecore is providing in the starter kit. Like I said, take advantage of those. You know, take a look at those, try to understand what's going on, and then, you know, make it your own. Ship something to QA. Get something out there. It's, you know, it's important not only just to, you know, fulfill your sprint goals, but it's going to boost your team's morale. Or you're going into a brand new tech stack, and oh my God, look, we've got something working. That feels great. Right? Stub out your components. Just pull the markup in straight from Storybook if it's available, or use a JPEG. Put a page together. Like we can stub out templates and layouts in Sitecore. We don't need to know Next.js to do that. You've got your information architecture. Put together a page, a functional promo component or something that's very simple. Show that to the client in the sprint demo. Everyone's going to be thrilled to see it. And I want to say, do your retros, right? One of the first things to go when you're starting to feel a little crunch on the project is your retros. Like, do we really need another 2-hour meeting at the end of the week? Do them early on. Get your team communicating. Get them talking about what's working, what's not working. Refine your patterns. You're like, you know what? We're doing this thing this way, and it's like adding all this drag. I really think we should cut this or add this. Super important. And I want to take a little time to talk about the mysterious realms of Experience Edge and Vercel. Again, people are like, yeah, I know what that is. And then you start to talk to them, and they're like, actually, what is that? What does it do in this solution? So what is Experience Edge? So quite simply put, it is your content in the cloud, right? It is not a Sitecore CD server. What do I mean when I say it's not a Sitecore CD server? It is not like a running instance of Sitecore like what we're used to, right? It's a completely separate data repository, and it is distributed across multiple data centers. Was it under the hood? We don't know. They don't tell us. Some of you probably do know. Doesn't matter. It hosts a layout service and the GraphQL endpoint that your head app is going to be using in production. If you're using XM Cloud, Experience Edge is part and parcel with that. You're going to be using it. Vercel. We have a couple delivery options, including, you know, our wonderful sponsor Netlify. We went with Vercel. Vercel they are the creators of Next.js. Seemed like a natural fit to host their application. So what is it? It's your website application in the cloud, right? I said before, you need somewhere to host this Node.js app that's going to, a request comes in, where does it go? Like the client's not going to do everything. It goes to Vercel. Vercel routes the request. It, returns a response with your page. It offers static site generation, dynamically delivered. What does that mean? It seems like a, contradictory statement. Yeah, you can get full SSG, but Vercel's got a little intelligence behind it. Maybe you've got a part of your page that isn't statically generated. That's going to be dynamic. You can do that with Vercel. CDN light tooling. Vercel, they say they're not a CDN, but they kind of are. It'll automatically scale if you're getting a lot of traffic. It'll, handle some sort of malicious requests and things like that. It offers you a platform to run middleware and sort of function apps and things like that. So it's got a little bit of everything. And you want to get there as soon as possible. Why do you want to get there as soon as possible? Because when you're working in your local environment and you're like, oh, this works great on my machine, right? And now I've got a VM that's just basically like a developer workstation, but it's a VM and we're calling it dev. And it's like, oh, it works on dev. I don't know what the problem is. Well, Vercel and Experience Edge are not dev. On dev, you're running a CD server, right? Which I just said, Experience Edge is not that. It's different. There's going to be differences. You're going to find things that work with a layout service running in a site like a Sitecore XP are not going to work in Experience Edge, or they're going to work differently, and it's going to catch you off guard if you're not preparing for it up front. Same with Vercel. Oh, my Next.js app works great, and I'm running Node 14 whatever in my local environment. When I got onto Vercel, now this language routing thing, this language selector is not working. Why is that? Well, you got to get on Vercel right away. You need to be QAing against the Experience Edge of Vercel. So, not every journey follows the happy path. There's a lot of planning and prep. You're still going to run into puzzles and hazards, and you're going to have to deal with them. So we're going to talk about some of those. So the first big one is dynamic content. I like to start with the definition. So what is dynamic content? It just means it's content that you retrieve based on its relationship to other content. So a very simple example might be if you have a news article, so you've got a list of news articles, and you click in through an article, and it's been tagged with a topic of hematology, right? Where's the hospital site? I want to surface other articles about hematology. How do I do that? I've tagged this page with a field in Sitecore that says the topic is hematology. Now I want to query for other pieces of content that are news articles, that content type, and have the tag hematology. How would we used to do that? We do that with the content search API, which is, you can still do that in XM Cloud. You can make a custom content resolver and use Solr, but don't. Just don't. They say not to, and I'm going to take their word for it on that. Sometimes we would use database queries. I'm sure you've all inherited a solution that have Sitecore fast queries and C# code, and you're just put your head down on your desk because you got to deal with it now. So why is dynamic content a challenge in a headless implementation? So simply put, because we can't do it the way we used to. We got to do it a new way. So how do we do it? The answer is GraphQL. I think you went too far.
Oh, did I?
No, I have the slides out of order. Okay, we'll go back after this one. So, all right, GraphQL, what is it for? GraphQL is for retrieving content that is not in the layout service response. So you're like, Chris, what is the layout service response? That's all the renderings on your page, right? When you publish to Experience Edge, a content page, Sitecore runs all the rendering pipelines behind the scene. XM Cloud does that, and it pushes a bunch of JSON to Experience Edge. That gets cached there, right? So if you've got dynamic content, you're not necessarily going to know what that is at publish time. I mean, you could do it with a content resolver, but now that's cached in Experience Edge. That's one of the reasons why that's not the best approach. Instead, we can do it in Vercel or in your Node app. So we're going to use GraphQL to do that. So GraphQL essentially it's a querying system to allow you to query Experience Edge for your content, right? So GraphQL, it has 3 implementations. If you have been trying to use this thing and you start searching around into the Sitecore blogosphere, you're going to see the legacy GraphQL stuff from like Sitecore 9.3. Don't use that. That doesn't work in Experience Edge. Completely different implementation. You got GraphQL for XM. That's what you're using on your local environments because you don't have Experience Edge. The language, the schemas are the same. Then you've got GraphQL for Experience Edge, which is what you're going to be using in XM Cloud. So you make sure you're using the right one for your task. Basically, don't use that first one. Yeah, back. Thanks. So okay, the GraphQL Rosetta Zone, like use the playground. If you don't know the playground exists, there is a GraphQL playground. You can like fool around with the queries, you can mess with it, it has IntelliSense, it's awesome, use it. Keep your queries simple. The queries have complexity limits, and it feels pretty arbitrary. You know, this clause that has like 2 field filters, and then you get another clause that only has 1 field filter, but suddenly that one blew up the complexity limit. Don't really know why, they don't really tell us why, you just sort of have to run your queries in advance, make sure they're gonna work before you ship them. And that comes back to planning ahead. So vet these requirements, like if you get a ticket that comes in, I'm gonna use GraphQL for this, make sure the query is gonna work before you commit and pick up that ticket. And sometimes the best query is no query at all. Can we do this without querying for content? Can we somehow get everything we need into the layout service and make it's okay to cache it? Ask those questions.
Cool. So, back to Coveo and some of the issues we ran into there. And again, we're running low on time, so I'm gonna try to speed this along. We went atomic. This was great for how little time it got us to get the pages up, but it did limit our feature availability, our design ability to kind of customize them. They're really quick, but trying to customize them in any real way is very time consuming. And not everything that Coveo can do is available in an atomic component. So there's that to be aware of. We did have some struggles with that. We had to go back and forth and see if we could trim some requirements in order to be able to use the atomic components. We did manage to make that work, so that's what we're using now. We also couldn't use Coveo for absolutely everything that was dynamic. There are still queries that are running GraphQL or the layout service. Not everything is reaching out to Coveo.
Coveo was kind of like our third line of defense. If the query was too complex for GraphQL, but we couldn't really push back on the business requirement, then we had to use Coveo.
Right. So that's when we had to use like a full search provider in order to get that dynamic content back. So if we were going to do it again, when we're in specs and designs, the more simple we can make sure those dynamic queries are, the better off we're going to be. Especially when there's smart caching and things you can do in there, but at the end of the day, it's a consumption cost model, so we want to keep those to a minimum. We had to create a second publishing target because Coveo doesn't crawl Experience Edge. So there is a database there that is a web database that just is there for Coveo to crawl. And that's all it does. And so there's 2 publishing targets there now, one for content and one for updating search. And if you haven't used Coveo before, configuring it can be a bit complex. There's a lot of levers to pull. I would recommend to trust the machine learning algorithm models that are in there. But reach out to your Coveo contacts if you have questions there. They're really good at helping you out with configurations. The other thing is we were using Personalize, and we had to deal with some paradigm shifts that had to happen here as well, because Personalize, as we know and have heard about a bunch of times now, is not XP. Not only does it work fundamentally different, but it's better at different things. So the components that we're creating for use on the website, like in XP, where we just be like, okay, well, under this condition, like just go show this other one I already made over here. It doesn't work with Personalized. Components have got to be built there separately than in the Sitecore like page editing. And there's fewer pre-built rules than XP, but ultimately personalized gives us more flexibility in use and is much more oriented toward conversions than I feel like a lot of the out-of-the-box XP stuff was. It will require front-end help when you're in there putting the components together. It is JS heavy. It is not that difficult to learn semantically and what needs to happen there for setup with those. Again, use the examples that are provided with personalized if you're going to make use of that. Run through them, take a look at them. It's really intuitive, kind of how you configure those and set those up in there once you dig into the examples you start with. And then we had to deal with multi-site, multilingual issues. Now, we've done so many XMXP implementations that we're very used to these things and how they function in that world. We're used to knowing exactly what items we have to go create and this, that, the other thing, and then they just kind of work. They work really well in the legacy system. There's a little bit more work that had to be done in the new stack for these. So we kind of took for granted that it was going to be a little bit tougher to set up in the new stack. The multi, we're still. Yeah, it's a good time. So if you see us at our computers later, that's probably why. But the SXA scaffolding for the multi-site is great. Make use of that. One of the things to note, especially if you're using Vercel or on any of the providers, honestly, is each site is going to require its own Vercel tenant. You can't just stick them all in the same IIS, like web tenant like you used to be able to do.
Oh, this is new and exciting development.
What? Strike it right now, live. That's huge. But with the, oh, you actually just moved on. Cool. The multilingual was an issue as well, though. Make sure you get a chance to try that out. There are nuances in implementation with SSG and a couple other things. And then there was the content migration. There were 5 sites. There's a lot of content in multiple different languages. And things were just being completely overhauled IA-wise and like page structure-wise. A lot of stuff to move. Not particular to the stack, but just a project thing you want to make sure you don't forget while you're in there. You've all dealt with content migration. The other thing is understanding, and this is going to be important, the content lifecycle for the client. Workflow fundamentally in Sitecore hasn't changed, right? You still have the same flows there, but we now have webhooks that we can use, so you might have better tie-ins to their out-of-Sitecore workflow that can help bring some business value there. Besides that, though, there are expectations that need to change around publishing predominantly, okay? Publishing to Edge, it takes a little bit longer than it did to publish to a WebDB when you're moving, Sitecore rows from one table to another, one database to another. Experience Edge is more like when you published with related items on and it had to scan through 35,000 items and send them all live for some reason. It runs a little bit closer to that. It takes a little bit longer. That expectation needs to be reset with the client if they're used to it being very zippy. The other thing is when you're dealing with static site generation, as we saw in the keynote this morning, the first time you hit that page, you're not going to see your new content. That's new for clients, and they need to be walked through that. It takes them a little while. We've been at this a couple of years. I'm still explaining it on a weekly basis. The dynamic and shared content might have to be rethought because, again, here it's the page itself that is static when we're talking about static generation. So if I publish out a shared piece, I probably need to republish the pages that it's on as well if I actually want to see that content updated there. Something to be thoughtful about when you're planning for shared content in these sites. What else do we got? Oh.
This one. Okay, so this is the last one here. We're almost out of time, but we want to say, like, when all else fails, call for backup, right? Like, you have support systems in place, take advantage of them. Like, Sitecore was very good working with us. We had a sort of a technical account manager. We had weekly meetings with them. We had weekly meetings with Vercel on the books. We had regular meetings with Coveo, Kairos, all our integration partners. Nurture those relationships. Go to the check-ins. Even if you've got nothing to say, attend those early meetings. Figure out a cadence that works for your team, right? Be open with the challenges you're facing early on. You're not admitting weakness by saying, I have no idea how this SaaS product works that has poor documentation, is a complete black box I can't debug. That's not weakness. That's just being honest. Use these people They get resourced to your project for a reason, so take advantage of it. Yeah. So just to wrap up real quick, go ahead. This is what the site's going to look like when it goes live next week. So if you check out Children's National at some point, probably after Friday next week, you can see an XM Cloud site with Next.js and Sitecore Personalize and Experience Edge and Coveo in action. This is a big implementation. So what that's bringing to bear is the flexibility of Sitecore. We've got the fully featured experience editor, totally flexible design system. If your team's comfortable working and authoring in Sitecore, none of that's going to change going to headless. It all works exactly the same from their perspective. And we also get, how does this tie back to our success criteria? Headless gives us more reliable deployments because we're deploying to one specific Vercel site, or we're deploying just to the platform. And static site generation protects against runtime errors. If you publish some content and it breaks your page, Vercel's not going to show that. It's going to show the old version of the content. We've got the speed of Vercel. So, performance, scalability, security. Performance is pretty obvious. Scalability, it automatically scales. Security, you're reducing sort of your attack footprint for some, because your content's completely disconnected, and it's also statically rendered. And so lightning fast pages, going back to the success criteria, better customer experience, and there are studies after studies that show that leads directly to conversions. Okay, and that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really it. There's a couple more slides, but that's a wrap.
Happy to take questions out in the hall.
Benefit from standing close to you guys. I will, first of all, add 50 cents to your presentation regarding multi-site and supplied by the question. So first of all, and you don't need to make a site per rendering host any longer. You can benefit from multi-site add-on. So that means your JSS application may have as many sites as you want, of course powered by SXA with XM Cloud. The documentation is a little bit clumsy, so it's not that easy to understand how it works, but it works, believe me. So the questions are, number one is, have you dealt with any DAM? Because we know there is a 50 megabyte limit for experience search for media items.
Yeah. We do not have a DAM like Content Hub in play. That has not been something. There are budget limitations as well. Like none of their assets are really going to go above that. And anything that does, like a video or whatever, we're hosting on an external sort of media provider.
And the second one, have you done any customizations to CM? Obviously you did. It's not recommended to do big customizations as site developers say, but I'd like to know which were yours.
So that's a good question. I know we have customizations, and I know that that's a big no-no. Unfortunately, to sort of fulfill some of our requirements, we were forced to take advantage. I mean, it's stuff that's in the docs that's out there, right? So like custom content resolvers, we talked about that. We do actually have a few of them because it was just the most efficient way to accomplish that requirement, right? I don't know if you can think of any more.
No, I'd say those are the big ones. The authoring side didn't need much work, but it is on our radar to go back and clean those up over time before they become an issue. So
the publishing target for Coveo was a big one. I don't know if that's going to break at some point in the future. We're just like through a SQL database at XM Cloud, and it's like, okay, it works.
Any questions from the audience?
How'd you do the multilingual site? I know I mentioned that last night at dinner, but did you use embedded TLDs? Like, how did you do that?
the backing of it is just Sitecore's multilingual functionality. The Vercel routing needed a little help there to kind of line that up with a Sitecore piece, which we weren't really expecting, and we're still fighting with a little bit. Yeah. But I mean, the base Sitecore multilingual functionality that we're used to works. It gets to experience Edge correctly. That piece is fine. So.
Yeah. So like your multilingual content It gets published to Experience Edge, and like your JSS app needs to sort of have contextual awareness. Like you used to have Sitecore context, whatever, and like you still have some of that context stuff, but it comes from the layout service. It's not in your session anymore, right? But your language kind of is, and you have to get the language into the context. And like we had it working locally, and then when we got to Vercel, it stopped working all the time, and that's what we're kind of one of our last challenges.
Questions?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you've had any experience with using Vercel's Turbo Repo, like their monorepo product, and with XM Cloud.
No, because we started this a while ago. So sort of the guidance we got was like Vercel is hooked up to a Git repo, and we have for each one of the sites, because they all have their own domains. So like each domain for one of the sites is a separate Vercel instance, and it's all the same repo, but sort of like pulling from a different branch, I guess. Is that accurate?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, so like our lead dev is not be here today, but I'm pretty sure that's how it's working. But no, we're not using the turbo repos.